This is a copy of the sermon that will be preached at North Shields Evangelical Church on Sunday the 30th of April. Before listening to it, if you could read a few chapters in Samuel, the book of 1 Samuel, if you could read chapter 27, chapter 29 and chapter 30. So in chapter 26 we meet David in the year before he became king. God had promised David he would be king back in chapter 16. And after 15 years this promise is just about to be fulfilled. But before David becomes king, David spent 1 year promoting the antiperspirant brand Sure. Sure won't let you down when you need it the most. In chapter 26, David repeatedly quoted this brand's slogan. Chapter 26, David says, "As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "the Lord himself will strike Saul, or his time will come." David was sure that God would fulfill his word, that Saul would be dethroned and God would appoint him as his replacement. David continues, "The Lord rewards everyone for their righteousness and faithfulness. As surely as I valued Saul's life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble." Even though David faced trouble, he was sure God would not let him down. Verse 25 of chapter 26, "Then Saul said to David, 'May you be blessed, David my son. You will do great things, and surely triumph.'" David was such a good advert for sure that even Saul was convinced. God would not let David down when he needed it the most. But the reason David was such a good advert for sure, the antiperspirant, was not because of what came out of here, but because of what was happening under here. David, we read in chapter 26 verse 25, and then I'll read chapter 27 verse 1. It says, "So David went on his way, and Saul returned home. But David thought to himself, 'One of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul.'" Truth is, David wasn't actually that sure. Yes, he believed God's promises, but after 15 years of endless waiting and relentless difficulty, doubts had entered his mind. And that's why David was such a good advert for sure. For though he was actually sweating under his armpits, he had everybody else convinced that he felt confident, cool, and at peace. I suspect many of us would also be a good advert for sure as well. We're good at convincing everybody else that we're sure, that we're confident of God's character, or that we're full of faith in God's word, or that we're totally at peace about the future. We're good at convincing everybody else that we're sure, but under our armpits we might actually be sweating buckets. Maybe you have your doubts about the worthwhileness of prayer. Maybe you question how life can be like this, yet God can still be good. Maybe you wonder if God has forgotten about you because his hand in your life is not quite as dramatic as you've come to expect. Maybe you fill the blank. Doubts, questions, a wavering faith. These are the Christian version of sweat patches under the armpits. Things that we don't want other people to see. For this reason, like David, we put on an outward show of confidence, even though we're not actually that sure. But why did David do this? And why might we still do the same? Well, doubt is often viewed as a sign of weakness or a sign that our faith is not healthy but sick. And in chapter 30 we see how both sickness and weakness are viewed. In verse 9 of chapter 30, David and the 600 men with him came to the Besor Valley, where some stayed behind. 200 of them were too exhausted to cross the valley. On the journey into battle, some of David's fighting men felt weak and unable to go on. Later, when the other 400 returned, proud and victorious, they looked down on those who'd been too weak to put up a fight. Then, in verse 11, David's men found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. He said, "I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago." This Egyptian's illness was a sign of weakness and a drain of the king's resources. And so his master left him behind. Left behind. That's what happens in a culture that takes pride in strength and victory and looks down on weakness and vulnerability. That's why we purchase Sure deodorant, to make out that we're confident when we're actually sweating buckets and anxious. That's why we quote Christian cliches, to make out that our faith is strong like everybody else's. That's why we might nod our heads at Bible study, whilst inside we're doing this. None of us wants to get looked down on or left behind, and so we make out that we're sure when we are not. But should such a culture be characteristic of God's people, the church? Well, in chapter 27 we see numerous reasons why God could have, and even should have, left David behind. David's doubts had caused him to leave Israel being the focus of the Jews' promises all the way back since the days of Abraham. David was essentially leaving behind his faith. David's doubt caused him to leave behind his integrity. He lied to keep his actions hidden from the Philistine king, and it's difficult to know what we should think of his numerous raids. David left behind all expectations of God doing what he said. David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines." David left behind, to a degree, his faith and trust in God. But did God leave David behind? If God was anything like the king of Philistia or David's fighting men, God would have looked down on David and abandoned him altogether. But God didn't. And that's what chapter 29 is all about. For as the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" David's doubts had grown to a point where he's not just a temporary doubter, temporarily taking time out. He's now about to fight for the Philistines against God's own people. His loyalties have shifted, his hopes have shifted. He's about to complete a full U-turn, and the Philistines' officers say to their king, "Send the man back, that he may return to his place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or you will turn against us during the fighting." You know, at the moment that David is about to put all his eggs in the one Philistine basket, at the moment where he's committing himself to his doubts, when he's giving up and giving in, God sovereignly overrules. God stops David fighting against the Israelites, an act which would have certainly disqualified David from future kingship. And then God, through David's circumstances, asks David to reconsider. Are you sure? Are you sure I'll let you down when you need it the most? What follows next is a story in which David's faith fights back. It's a story about God turning up to strengthen David's faith when he needed it the most. We read in verse 6 that David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. David's situation got worse. His wives and his officers' families get taken. And so David's doubts multiply. All his officers now speak of stoning him. But this time David faces his doubts, faces them face on, and fights back. He found strength in the Lord his God, and then God gives David the encouragement he needs. David seeks God, God turns up. God makes a promise, God fulfills it. And though David wasn't appointed king the next day, he kept clinging on. He kept clinging on to God's other promises for that little bit longer. And after clinging on for that little bit longer, David sees God's other promises prove true. Now, I don't know how far across the line into doubt you are. You might be genuinely sure, confident in your faith. You might be unsure, but hiding it. You might even be sure that your doubts are right. The message for us all is basically the same. God has a heart for those who doubt. Jesus once said, "What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep, and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills, and go to look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he is happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish." One thing you can be sure of, God has a consistent record of going after those who doubt. God went the extra mile to go after David, Abraham, Moses, Gideon, Job, Elijah, Thomas, all of these who voiced their doubts out loud. God helped them. And Jesus left us with a parable that reminds us about God's heart for those who doubt. God's heart for you if you are in the unsure, or sure but also unsure category. So come to God if you have doubts. There's enough truth there to prove your doubts are wrong. But come to God, for he is patient and merciful when dealing with those who doubt. God also wants those who are sure, who are confident, to have a heart for those who maybe aren't that confident. We read in chapter 30 verse 21 that David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him, and who were left behind at the Besor Valley. They came out to meet David, and the men with him. The warriors returned from the battlefield, boasting war wounds and battle trophies. And David leads them, a man with a history and a six-pack that would put Stallone, Schwarzenegger and Jason Statham to shame. And what's the first thing David goes and does when he returns from the battlefield? What's his attitude towards those who were too exhausted to even fight? Well, David didn't look down on them. He didn't sarcastically ask them about their splinter. David did not say, "If you'd only more strength, you'd be more like me." David had had first-hand experience of weakness. David had been on the receiving end of God's patience and mercy himself. And so the first thing David did on returning from the battlefield was this. David asked, "How are you?" How are you in your words? Don't tell me what you think I want to hear, that things are okay. Don't tell me what will make my life as leader easier. Don't tell me simply that everything's fine. Tell me how you are in your words. I know that's maybe elaborating a bit on what David said, but it's quite amazing that David, the strong man, would approach those who were weak and simply ask, "How are you?" And so as David and his men approached, he asked them how they were. But all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, "Because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered." David replied, "No, my brothers, you must not do that which the Lord has given with what the Lord has given us. The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike." David made this a statute and ordinance for Israel from that day to this. David's attitude was in stark contrast to his officers. They were proud, they berated these weak others, they refused to help. But David responds by making it a rule that the strong should help the weak. Now, this principle seems to be a consistent principle throughout the Bible. Jesus said, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones." Paul said, "We urge you, brothers and sisters, encourage the disheartened, help the weak, be patient with everyone." Jude writes, "Be merciful to those who doubt." If you are someone in the genuinely sure category, I hope one of the things that you're sure of is this: we all have a need for patience and mercy and help. That's something everybody of us in this room can be sure of. And since this is the case, we are to carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Like Christ, we are to help each other during times when we are unsure. For like David, Christ himself had first-hand experience of human weakness. On the cross, Jesus' faith was tested. On the cross, every doubt that enters your head probably entered his. Like David, Christ can empathize with those who experience weakness, and he calls you and I to do the same.